That was all it took for everything to shift. 1 minute ago, a quiet message flickered across a private palace communication channel, traveled through a chain of senior courtiers, and landed, like a thunderclap, into the hands of the very people who had been waiting for this moment for months. And 1 minute ago, the world Meghan Markle thought she understood changed forever, because the palace had finally done it. They had pulled the lever. They had activated a new protocol. One that insiders whispered about for years. One that critics once dismissed as impossible, and one that Meghan herself believed would never happen. Yet here we are. And the question none of us can avoid is simple. Why now? Why today? Why this sudden, brutal, irreversible shift in Meghan Markle's royal future? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had that moment where you realized the consequences you thought you had outrun were actually walking right behind you the entire time? Where every choice, every public moment, every headline you believed you controlled suddenly turned around and controlled you instead. That's the moment Meghan is living in right now. But don't take my word for it. Let's start at the beginning of this unraveling, because the truth is, this wasn't a spontaneous decision. This wasn't a snap judgment from King Charles or a late-night panic from senior advisors. This was a long, calculated, strategic move, and the seeds were planted years ago. Imagine this, a small room inside Buckingham Palace. Heavy curtains pulled shut, a polished conference table that reflects every tense expression in the room. Senior advisors sitting shoulder to shoulder, each with a stack of documents, each with a reason to be wary. On that table sits a thin leather folder. Innocent looking on the outside, but explosive on the inside. A folder with one title: Public Use of Royal Titles, Updated Recommendations. It was drafted quietly, whispered about privately, and kept behind locked doors. And back then, during its earliest stages, nobody actually believed it would be enforced. Not really. Not against a member of the royal family, even one who stepped back. But as one advisor said in that room, protocol exists for a reason. And if it is never used, then it isn't protocol, it's decoration. That line would echo for years. But the real question is, why did it echo the loudest today? Let me paint the scene for you. Hours before the leak, senior palace officials gathered again. Older now, wearier, but sharper. You could see it in their faces. Today was different. Today there was urgency, frustration, and something else too. Finality. It was clear that a tipping point had been reached. The sort of moment that doesn't come often in royal history, but when it does, it becomes the kind of event people talk about for decades. You might imagine hushed voices, shuffling papers, a clock ticking too loudly in the background. But no, this time, there was no whispering. This time, the decision came with a clarity so sharp it cut through the room like a blade. It is time, one senior figure said. The protocol is to be enacted, effective immediately. But what does that actually mean? Let's break it down. For years, Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, former working royal, global public figure, has continued to use certain royal styles, symbols, and associations during media appearances, public speeches, event introductions, and Hollywood-related branding. To her, it was identity. To the palace, it became liability. Not instantly, not dramatically. It built slowly, layer by layer, like ice forming on the edge of a lake until one day it cracks. And that crack was today, because for the first time ever, palace insiders received authorization for something unprecedented. New restrictions that would prevent Meghan from using royal titles or associations during any public appearance, event, collaboration, introduction, or media setting. It is, in effect, the closest the palace can come to saying, you may have once carried the title, but you may no longer use it. Not revoked. Worse, rendered unusable. And that's why this moment hits so hard. Because losing a title is one thing, but being told you can still hold it, but never mention it, never use it in speeches, never attach it to projects, never allow the public to associate it with your brand, that's not just restriction. That's fragmentation of identity. That is why, according to insiders, Meghan's first reaction was not anger, not outrage, not public pushback. It was fear. Real, trembling, breath holds in the throat fear. Because this isn't simply about titles. It's about relevance. It's about legacy. It's about power. Let me ask you, If everything you built your post-royal life upon, your image, your personal brand, your narrative, suddenly had to stand without the titles that once amplified it, what would be left? Would the world see you differently? Would the opportunities shrink? Would the media tone shift? Those are the questions Meghan faced 1 minute ago. But let me pull you deeper into this story, because you deserve the full picture. Behind the scenes, the palace has been tracking every instance of title use during Meghan's public appearances. Not obsessively, not emotionally, but systematically, like marking data on a spreadsheet. Every introduction at a Hollywood gala, every documentary press release that referenced status, every event program where Duchess was printed in bold. Every time her status was indirectly used to elevate a project or public appearance. The palace saw it all. They watched. They waited. They analyzed. One moment didn't trigger this. One phrase didn't set the royal machinery into motion. It was accumulation. A slow burn that turned into a spark that finally hit dry timber. And that timber? The palace's growing belief that continued royal title use by a non-working member blurred the lines of monarchy, politics, influence, and commercial gain. Let me ask you another question. If you were the palace, would you allow a title, rooted in centuries of tradition, to be used in Hollywood branding? Whether you agree or disagree, the palace had its answer. No more. But this isn't just about title use. It's about something deeper. Control. The monarchy has survived for centuries not because it is powerful, but because it is disciplined. It chooses when to act, how to act, and whom it acts upon with precision. And when the protocol finally reached the king's desk today, there were no more debates. No more hesitations. Just a decision so sharp, so sweeping, that aides described the atmosphere as icy. But there's something even more fascinating about this story. The palace wasn't planning to reveal the new protocol today. It wasn't supposed to leak today. It wasn't supposed to become part of the global conversation today. Yet it did. And that raises a massive question. Who leaked it? Who wanted the world to know this now, at this exact minute, in this exact form? Was it a senior royal frustrated with silence? A staffer angry at behind-the-scenes tensions? A strategist who believed the public needed to witness this moment? Or was it something far more complicated? We're going to get to that. Oh, we absolutely are. But before we do, you need to understand something crucial. This protocol is not symbolic. It comes with structure, teeth, mechanisms. And those mechanisms will affect Meghan's public life in ways most people haven't even begun to imagine. If you think this is just about removing a few words from a title card on a stage, you're in for a shock. Because the first layer is already devastating. But the second, the one that no one outside the palace was supposed to know about, changes the entire story. And in a moment, we're going to dive into how this protocol actually works. But before we do, something else happened behind the scenes today. Something nobody saw coming. And it wasn't from the palace. It came from someone far closer to Meghan. Someone who changed the entire tone of this moment with a single message. But we'll get to that. That message, short, almost innocuous, but heavy with implications, arrived just after the initial leak. Its contents were enough to make even the most composed advisors pause, blink, and lean back in their chairs. It was one of those moments where you realize the narrative isn't just shifting, it's flipping entirely. Because the palace, as calculated and methodical as it is, hadn't planned for this. And this is exactly what made Meghan tremble. You might be wondering, what exactly could trigger fear like this in someone who has faced intense media scrutiny, criticism, and public judgment for years? The answer is control. When the control you believed you had over your image, your brand, your identity, and even your very name is stripped away, even slowly, piece by piece. It's terrifying. Fear doesn't come from failure. It comes from inevitability. And today, the inevitability hit Meghan like a cold, unyielding wave. Let's rewind for a moment and put this into perspective. For years, Meghan's life has been a complex balancing act. Hollywood glamour, royal expectations, media scrutiny, personal ambition, and public perception. She navigated these waters with remarkable skill, or at least it seemed so from the outside. Every appearance, every speech, every carefully crafted photo op contributed to a larger narrative. The successful, modern duchess who could bridge worlds. Hollywood and monarchy, fame and tradition. But here's the catch. every bridge has limits. Every line between worlds has boundaries. And those boundaries, over time, had been crossed, stretched, and tested. You see, it isn't just about a title. It's about perception, influence, and legacy. To the outside world, Duchess of Sussex is a name. To Meghan, it's identity. But to the palace, it's history, tradition, and authority. And when someone outside the inner circle manipulates that authority, even unintentionally, the institution reacts. Slowly, methodically, and then decisively. Today, that reaction reached its crescendo. But here's what most people don't realize. This isn't about punishment. Not exactly. It's about precedent. About signaling to the public, to staff, to other members of the family, that rules exist. Boundaries exist. And crossing them has consequences. And yet, there's an ironic twist in all this. Because while the palace's move might seem calculated, precise, and cold, the real chaos emerged from a source entirely unexpected. Someone who had been quiet for years, watching from the sidelines, suddenly made a single choice. A choice that amplified the impact of the palace's protocol and forced Meghan into a corner she couldn't escape. That's when fear turns into panic. When calculated decisions collide with unpredictable variables. When every advisor, every aide, every lawyer realizes the story has left the realm of control entirely. Now, imagine being Meghan for a second. You wake up to messages confirming that your public identity, the very thing that legitimized your voice, your influence, your narrative, is now constrained by rules you neither drafted nor agreed to. And then you hear, through channels you cannot verify, that someone close to you has leaked even more details, details that hint at deeper consequences, consequences that may affect not just you, but your family, your public persona, your legacy. It's a moment of disbelief. 1 minute, you feel powerful. The next, powerless. The ground beneath you doesn't shift gradually. It drops away, leaving you suspended in uncertainty. And that's where we are now. At the precipice of a story that has been quietly building for years. One that now explodes into the public domain with the force of a revelation. A story where the stakes aren't just headlines. They are identity, control, and survival in a world that can be unforgiving, especially when the rules change overnight. But here's the kicker. While we can analyze, theorize, and speculate, one truth remains crystal clear. This moment is more than a protocol, more than a restriction. It is the signal of a shift in power dynamics that could redefine everything about Meghan Markle's place in the royal landscape. It's the start of a chain reaction. And if you think this is just about public appearances, titles, or branding, you're only scratching the surface. Because in the coming chapters, you'll see exactly how this protocol came to be. You'll meet the key players, the advisors, the strategists, and the insiders who shaped every word, every clause, every limitation. You'll see the emails, the memos, the conversations that built this carefully orchestrated storm. And, most importantly, you'll witness Meghan's reaction, the human side of this crisis, the emotional impact, the trembling fear that rippled through every corner of her life. And trust me, it gets more intense from here. Because while the palace may have intended this as a controlled, internal measure, once information leaks, even partially, the narrative explodes. Headlines, social media, global commentary, all of it converges, amplifying the effect. The pressure, the scrutiny, the questions. Every second, the public begins to dissect, analyze, and judge, while Meghan is left navigating the consequences of rules she never agreed to and a story she can't control. And that's why this matters, not just for Meghan, but for the institution, for her family, and for the perception of monarchy in the modern age. Because when a royal protocol affects one individual so dramatically, it inevitably ripples outward. Public perception, media strategies, Hollywood opportunities, philanthropic efforts, they all hang in the balance. Every single decision, every word spoken, every appearance made from this point forward will be scrutinized through the lens of this new reality. But here's the twist you didn't see coming. Even as Meghan reels from the immediate consequences, there's a hidden layer. A layer that only a few insiders are aware of. A layer so sensitive, so volatile, that if it becomes public, it could change not just Meghan's royal future, but potentially the public's understanding of how power, influence, and identity intersect within the monarchy. And that is where the real story begins. Because moments like these are rare. Moments where control is wrested away, where legacy hangs in the balance, where an individual must confront a reality they neither anticipated nor prepared for. And for Meghan Markle, 1 minute ago was that moment. 1 minute ago, the narrative pivoted. 1 minute ago, the protocols were leaked. And 1 minute ago, fear became a tangible, visible force. One of the most shocking things about crises is how quietly they begin. Often, the world only notices the aftermath. The explosion, the headlines, the viral clips. But the chain reaction, that almost always starts in silence. For Meghan Markle, that chain reaction began years ago. Long before any public outcry, long before any headlines questioned her royal role, a quiet process had been underway inside the palace. A process that would one day determine whether she could use her titles in public appearances. It began with a single document. A simple file labeled, Public Use of Royal Titles. Guidelines and Recommendations. On its own, it didn't look threatening. A stack of papers, legal jargon, formal tone. But insiders knew differently. This was the first domino. And once it fell, the rest would follow. Imagine the scene. A small, dimly lit office inside Buckingham Palace. Walls lined with portraits of monarchs past. Thick curtains muffling the sounds of the outside world. Around the table sit the senior advisors. Lawyers, protocol experts, courtiers who had been watching the monarchy evolve for decades. Every face is focused, every gesture precise, every word measured. On the table is the folder, the document, the spark. The discussion is calm, almost polite. But beneath the surface, tension crackles. One advisor leans forward. We've been monitoring public appearances, official statements, and media interactions for the past 2 years, she says, flipping through the document. The consistent use of royal titles by a non-working member is unprecedented. It blurs boundaries. It sets precedent. It cannot continue. Another nods. We are not discussing revocation here. We are discussing restriction, control of use. This is a subtle but critical distinction. A third, older member, voice low and deliberate. Subtle or not, the impact is significant. If left unchecked, it will affect public perception, legal standing, and ultimately, the integrity of the institution. And there it is. That single phrase, integrity of the institution, the one that makes even the most loyal courtiers shiver. Integrity is the monarchy's currency. When it's threatened, nothing else matters. You might be thinking, why would Meghan's public use of her title matter so much? After all, she's no longer a working royal. She stepped back. She relocated. She pursued a private life, philanthropic projects, even Hollywood opportunities. But in the eyes of the palace, appearances matter. Titles matter. Every title carries weight, influence, and a whisper of authority. And when someone uses that influence outside the confines of the monarchy, the institution feels vulnerable. What's fascinating, and almost cinematic, is how measured the entire process was. There were no shouting matches, no public ultimatums. Instead, this was strategy. Chess. Every step anticipated, every move calculated. They studied Meghan's speeches, the branding of her initiatives, the subtle ways in which titles were used in conjunction with her name. They mapped potential consequences. They predicted media reactions. And in every single scenario, the conclusion was the same. Action was required. One could almost feel the weight of history in that room. These advisors were not only defending protocol, they were defending centuries of tradition. A single misstep in judgment could ripple across generations, they knew, and Meghan's case was unlike any they had seen before. The combination of celebrity influence, international exposure, and media scrutiny created a perfect storm. And here's a fact most people don't realize. The first discussions about restricting Meghan's title usage happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, during casual protocol meetings. It was mentioned in passing at first, an aside about potential risks. But over time, it gained traction. Over months, then years, the issue escalated from a footnote to a full-blown agenda item. The dossier grew. Evidence was compiled. Recommendations were drafted. It was a slow, relentless build-up, a fire that no one could see until it exploded. What's particularly striking is the subtle psychology behind it. The advisors were not motivated by personal animosity. There was no hidden vendetta. Instead, they were acting out of institutional preservation. The palace does not respond to fame. It does not respond to popularity. It responds to precedent. And Meghan's trajectory, Hollywood projects, global speaking engagements, media exposure, was unprecedented. The advisors knew that if a non-working royal could wield influence while publicly using royal titles, it would open a door no one could close. By the time the document was finalized, it had evolved into more than a guideline. It was a blueprint. A subtle, unyielding mechanism of control designed to ensure that Meghan's public presence would no longer blur the line between personal ambition and royal authority. But let's be honest, no amount of internal planning could predict the chaos that would unfold once this blueprint became a live protocol. Because humans are unpredictable, people leak information, media thrives on scandal, and celebrities, especially those with global influence, have a way of turning every constraint into a headline. That's exactly what happened. The first domino fell in silence, but the next ones fell with noise. Headlines, social media speculation, influencer commentary, insider reports, each amplified the original impact. The carefully orchestrated strategy was suddenly in the public eye, and Meghan, who had once been able to anticipate and influence public perception, found herself reacting to a narrative she could no longer control. Think about that for a moment. The people around her, the advisors, the lawyers, the staff, had spent months, years even, strategizing this protocol. They calculated every consequence, every loophole, every public reaction. And yet, the human element, the leak, the message from someone close, the unpredictability of perception, turned everything on its head. And in that moment, fear became real. Not theoretical, not symbolic, tangible, palpable. A shiver that runs through your body, a tightening in your chest, the awareness that you are no longer in control. That is the moment Meghan Markle faced when the first domino fell. But here's the kicker. The first domino was only the beginning. There were more, many more, each one positioned carefully, each one destined to trigger a reaction more powerful than the last. And the full story? The truth of how this protocol came together, why it was enacted, and the reactions it provoked, is far more intense than anyone outside the palace could have imagined. Because while the initial folder, the first meeting, and the calm, calculated discussions set the stage, the real drama begins when humans, the most unpredictable element in the equation, step onto the scene. And that is exactly what happened next. Someone close to Meghan, someone she trusted, made a move that accelerated the sequence. A move that forced the palace to act faster, to finalize details, to send ripples through both the media and the monarchy. A move that transformed a quiet, internal process into a public spectacle and sent Meghan into the very fear we discussed earlier. Who do you think wields the most quiet but terrifying power inside a place like Buckingham Palace? Not the king, not the queen consort, not even the public-facing advisors. The real power, insiders often say, lies in the people who know how to move behind the scenes, those whose influence is invisible but decisive. And in Meghan Markle's unfolding crisis, one such figure emerged as a key player. One name kept appearing in the confidential memos, the private discussions, the strategy meetings about title restrictions. And it wasn't obvious at first. This person was someone Meghan likely interacted with politely, maybe even warmly, but never suspected could wield so much influence over her fate. Someone who understood protocol, power, and perception better than anyone else in the room. Let me paint the picture. It's mid-morning in London. Outside, the streets are buzzing with the usual city hum, oblivious to the storm brewing inside the palace walls. Inside, advisors gather again, this time not around a polished conference table, but in a more intimate setting, a side room reserved for sensitive discussions. The air is tense. Everyone knows this meeting is pivotal. And then, the insider speaks. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a calm, measured voice, the kind that carries weight because everyone knows it comes with authority. The situation has escalated beyond advisory discussion. They say, we need direct action. Meghan's continued use of royal titles in public contexts sets a precedent we cannot allow. It must be addressed immediately. Boom. That single statement is the trigger. A quiet assertion of authority, yet with the force of a hammer striking steel. It's not just advice, it's a call to action. And it is treated as final. What's fascinating here, and this is critical, this insider didn't act impulsively. Every step had been calculated. Every potential consequence weighed. Every public reaction anticipated. This wasn't about personal animosity toward Meghan. Far from it. This was about preserving the monarchy, maintaining precedent, and ensuring that one member's actions didn't destabilize centuries of tradition. But here's the twist. This insider's influence went beyond policy. They understood the human element, the emotional pulse of everyone in the room, the subtleties that can shift decisions faster than any formal report. And by choosing this moment to speak, they effectively forced everyone's hand. The protocol, which had been simmering quietly, suddenly became urgent, immediate, unavoidable. Now let's talk about what they knew, because this is what makes the story so fascinating. This insider had access to years of data, carefully compiled by the palace. Every public appearance, every media interview, every press release involving Meghan's titles had been cataloged. And what they noticed wasn't just repetition, it was escalation. Meghan's name carried weight. Her brand, combined with royal association, amplified her voice internationally in ways unprecedented for a non-working royal. To the casual observer, it might seem minor, a title here, a mention there. But to the palace, it was a slippery slope. Influence outside the monarchy had become measurable, and measurable influence can threaten the very perception the institution relies upon. So this insider did something decisive. They brought the dossier forward. They presented it to senior advisors, highlighting every point of concern. And crucially, they added context, a forecast of what could happen if no action was taken. Potential fallout, public perception, media scrutiny, internal confusion, international implications. Every domino, every risk laid out on the table. The room shifted. The calm professionalism gave way to quiet recognition. Everyone knew this was serious. And suddenly, what had been a theoretical discussion became urgent. Here's where it gets even more interesting. This insider didn't just push for restrictions. They recommended a framework. Specific, actionable, enforceable measures that would define what Meghan could and could not do with her titles. And because they were precise, because they were grounded in precedent and protocol, the recommendations couldn't be ignored. The advisors had no choice but to accept that action needed to be taken. But this is where human psychology enters the story. Because once the insiders aligned on the course of action, the next challenge wasn't enforcement, it was timing. When should Meghan be informed? When should the public be aware? How could they minimize backlash while maintaining authority? These weren't legal questions. They were questions of strategy, optics, and human behavior. And the insider played a central role in shaping all of it. You might be asking yourself, who is this insider? What makes them so influential? While names remain confidential to the public, the characteristics are clear, meticulous, loyal to the institution, politically astute, and unafraid to challenge even the highest authority when necessary. They are the type of person who sees risk before it happens and acts before it becomes irreversible. And in this case, their decision to accelerate the protocol's timeline, quietly, decisively, changed the trajectory of Meghan's public identity forever. Now here's where the drama deepens. Not everyone in the room agreed. Even with the insider's influence, there were advisors who cautioned patience. We can't rush this, they said. She's aware of public scrutiny. A sudden enforcement may create backlash. But the insider's reputation, knowledge, and subtle authority won out. The decision was final. The protocol would move forward. The dominoes were set in motion. And the consequences? Immediate. Within hours, documents were drafted, communications prepared, and the framework formalized. Not publicly, not yet. This was the invisible machinery of monarchy in action. By the time anyone outside the palace would hear whispers, the entire structure would already be in place. But here's the human element that adds an emotional spike. Meghan herself was completely unaware. In all her carefully orchestrated media appearances, in all her planning and strategizing, she had no idea that the first domino had fallen, no idea that an invisible hand had triggered the next stage of her public restrictions. And that unawareness, in retrospect, is what made the next moments so devastating. Because once information started leaking, once the protocol began to reach the public sphere, Meghan had to react, but not on her own terms. Every move she made was framed by the rules she didn't yet fully understand. Her team scrambled to assess the implications. Her advisors debated potential responses. And through it all, the insider who triggered this chain of events remained a calm, invisible force behind every decision, watching the dominoes continue to fall. Now let's pause and reflect. This isn't just a story about internal palace politics. It's about power dynamics, influence, and the subtle ways authority is exercised. This insider didn't yell, didn't confront, didn't create drama. They acted quietly, strategically, with precision. And that, more than anything, ensured that when the public learned of the protocol, it had maximum impact. Because timing is everything. And influence, when exercised correctly, is almost invisible until its effects are undeniable. And that is why this chapter ends on a cliffhanger. Because while the first domino fell quietly, its consequences were anything but quiet. The insider had set a sequence in motion that would lead to public exposure, internal chaos, and an unprecedented challenge to Meghan's identity and influence. But here's the question that hangs over everything. What exactly did this insider know about the potential fallout? And did they anticipate how Meghan would react once the protocol started becoming public knowledge? Imagine this. The world is watching. Every step, every word, every appearance is dissected. Every photograph, every caption, every headline becomes evidence in a quiet, invisible investigation. For Meghan Markle, this is no hypothetical scenario. It is her reality. By the time the insider triggered the protocol in Chapter 2, Meghan had unknowingly entered the final stage, public scrutiny as a catalyst for enforcement. You see, the palace doesn't operate in isolation. Policies can be drafted, protocols can be designed, but nothing ignites the machinery like the public stage. And Meghan's global presence provided that stage in abundance. Let's rewind to her appearances just prior to the leak. Meghan had been carefully managing her post-royal image, appearing at select events, delivering speeches, attending philanthropic galas, and speaking at international forums. Every moment was curated, polished, and strategically shared with media outlets. To her team, this was brand management. To the palace, it became a dossier of evidence. It wasn't just appearances. It was influence in motion, a subtle tilt of the scales that, when combined with her royal association, elevated her voice far beyond what a celebrity or philanthropist might achieve alone. And that was the problem. The advisors noticed patterns. Every time Meghan appeared at a media event, her title was referenced in introductions, captions, or press releases. Every time she attended a speaking engagement, invitations highlighted her royal connection. Every philanthropic initiative subtly leveraged the authority that comes with a duchess's title. At first, it seemed harmless, almost ceremonial. But the palace saw trends. Repetition, amplification, influence. The pattern became undeniable. Meghan's presence was no longer just her own. It was entwined with the monarchy, and that created complications. Let's break down one specific instance. A major global charity announced a fundraising gala. Meghan was invited as a guest speaker. Her team carefully crafted the invitation letters, press materials, and promotional content. Every reference subtly, but unmistakably, highlighted her status, her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex. The media amplified this, and photos of Meghan at the event circulated worldwide. Headlines mentioned her title, her influence, and her association with charitable initiatives. From a brand perspective, it was genius. But from a palace perspective, it was a line that couldn't be crossed repeatedly. Because precedent matters. What happens once? It can be dismissed. What happens every time? That becomes the expectation. And once precedent exists, it becomes extremely difficult to undo. Inside Buckingham Palace, the discussions grew urgent. Senior advisors reviewed the footage, press coverage, social media metrics, and public reactions. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Action was needed before the precedent solidified further. This is where the emotional stakes come into play. Think about Meghan, carefully planning her appearances, not fully aware of the protocol quietly waiting behind the scenes. She is acting in good faith, presenting herself to the world. And yet, unknowingly, she's triggering mechanisms designed to constrain her. One advisor, speaking in private, later described the situation like this: "It's not punitive. It's preemptive. We are responding to patterns, not moments. But patterns have weight, and weight forces consequences." Meanwhile, Meghan's public team noticed the subtle shift in coverage but misread the signals. The media was reporting with increased scrutiny, not because of her behavior, but because the palace's internal protocol was now effectively influencing public narrative. Every article, every commentary, every social media post became an indirect reinforcement of the very restrictions that were being designed behind the scenes. It's a fascinating interplay between human perception and institutional control. The palace doesn't need to act overtly to create impact. Subtle leaks, strategic positioning of documents, and careful attention to public appearances create a feedback loop that magnifies every action the individual takes. Meghan's appearances, which were meant to reinforce her brand and personal initiatives, instead became triggers for enforcement of the new rules. Now let's examine the psychological impact. Imagine realizing that every carefully orchestrated appearance, every speech, every philanthropic announcement could now be used as evidence against your autonomy. It's a form of indirect control that hits harder than direct confrontation. Meghan, reportedly, began noticing subtle changes. More questions from journalists about her title usage, more emphasis on the non-working royal aspect, and an increasing number of advisors urging caution. But the most impactful moment came during a high-profile international summit. Meghan was introduced by the event organizers with her full royal title. The media coverage exploded. Photographs and captions highlighted her royal association, sparking global conversation about her post-royal role. For the palace, this was the tipping point. The protocol, which had been carefully drafted and quietly approved, could no longer remain dormant. The first domino had already fallen, Chapter 1. The insider had triggered the sequence, Chapter 2, and now public appearances had accelerated the timeline. The machinery of enforcement was moving faster than anyone could anticipate. Yet here's the twist: Meghan herself remained unaware. She continued to operate with the assumption that her appearances were routine, that her team controlled messaging, and that her public influence was benign. In reality, each event provided additional justification for the palace to formalize restrictions. Each speech, each photo, each headline became part of the record that would define her new limits. And here's where it gets intense. The moment the palace decided to act, communications were drafted. Not for Meghan's team, not for public consumption, but for internal use. Legal teams, protocol advisors, and senior courtiers began coordinating how to enforce the restrictions. They discussed which titles could no longer appear in public announcements, which media references needed adjustment, and how to guide third-party organizations without creating confrontation. This was unprecedented. Never before had the palace designed such precise constraints on a non-working member's public identity. It was a mixture of subtlety, enforceability, and psychological impact. And the ripple effect? It was massive. Every public appearance from this point forward was framed not just by her personal choices, but by institutional control mechanisms she hadn't anticipated. But what happened next pushed the drama even further. Because once the palace's internal discussions leaked, even partially, the global media jumped into action. Headlines splashed across screens. Meghan's royal future in question. Palace protocol could limit Duchess's public role. What this means for Meghan Markle. Suddenly, the public narrative accelerated faster than any internal planning could control. Meghan, watching the coverage, began to sense that something was wrong. A subtle panic set in. Advisors scrambled. Emails were exchanged. Phone calls were made. And yet, even as she sought clarity, the full extent of the protocol remained hidden. She could sense the constraint, the tightening grip, but not the details. And that, dear viewer, is where this chapter ends. The public appearances that were meant to define her influence had instead become the accelerant for the palace's unprecedented enforcement. The stage was set, the dominoes were falling faster, and Meghan was caught in a web of consequences she hadn't anticipated. But here's the cliffhanger. What specific details did the protocol contain? Which titles were restricted? And how would these new rules directly affect Meghan's upcoming public engagements? The moment that would define Meghan Markle's post-royal public life arrived quietly, but with a gravity that no one could ignore. The protocol, which had been simmering behind closed doors for months, was finally formalized. And when it leaked, intentionally or not, the implications were explosive. Imagine the scene. A pristine office inside Buckingham Palace, thick carpet muffling footsteps, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the walls adorned with portraits of monarchs past. Senior advisors and legal experts sit in tense silence. On the table, the document that will change everything. A simple folder, leather-bound, unassuming to the casual observer. But inside, it contains precise, enforceable rules that will restrict Meghan's ability to publicly associate herself with royal titles. The first page opens with the most innocuous statement possible: updated guidelines for the public use of royal titles by non-working members. Harmless on its own, but it is followed by a series of clauses that are anything but benign. Clause 1. Non-working members may retain their titles in private life, correspondence, and legal documents, but may not use them in public-facing events, media appearances, or commercial endeavors. Every public introduction must omit royal styling. This is the first blow. Meghan can no longer be introduced as the Duchess of Sussex at any public function. Every speech, every gala, every international summit must now refer to her by name alone. Clause 2. Any promotional or philanthropic activity must clearly state the individual's non-working status. Use of royal-associated branding or imagery is prohibited. Fundraising campaigns, media promotions, and social media campaigns must remove or clarify all references to royal influence. In short, Meghan's brand, once intertwined with royal authority, is being legally and formally severed. Clause 3. Enforcement mechanisms are clearly defined. Violations, intentional or unintentional, will be addressed through internal audits, written notices, and, if necessary, legal intervention. This is not symbolic. It is enforceable. For Meghan, the implications are immediate and tangible. Every carefully curated project, every speaking engagement, every public appearance, all of it is suddenly constrained by rules drafted thousands of miles away. A life once guided by influence, identity, and personal branding is now mapped by bureaucratic authority. And here's the psychological impact. It's one thing to have a title revoked. It's another to retain the title but be told you cannot publicly use it. It creates a cognitive dissonance, a tension between identity and restriction, between perception and reality. For someone whose public persona had been meticulously built, this is seismic. But it gets worse. The protocol doesn't stop at appearances or titles. It reaches into media interactions, interviews, press releases, and even casual public statements. Every time Meghan speaks publicly, every time a journalist references her past title, every time a photographer frames her in relation to royal symbols, the guidelines are triggered. Enforcement isn't abstract, it's immediate. Every act is a potential breach. Let's pause for a moment to consider the human drama. Meghan, carefully planning her next philanthropic initiative, is suddenly forced to ask herself, can I even mention my royal association? Will this speech now require legal approval? Can my team navigate these restrictions without sparking backlash or violating the protocol? The weight of these questions is immense, and it is compounded by the fact that the public is already watching, speculating, and commenting. And then there's the media. Once the protocol leaked, even partially, the headlines began to spread like wildfire. Meghan Markle faces new royal restrictions. Duchess of Sussex must alter public appearances. Palace protocol threatens Meghan's public influence. Social media commentary exploded, with analysts, influencers, and fans dissecting every detail. What had been a carefully controlled process behind closed doors now became a global spectacle. For Meghan, the effect was instantaneous. Advisors reported that she trembled upon first learning the full scope of the restrictions. Friends and aides noted visible anxiety, moments of disbelief, and an urgent need to reassess all public engagements. This was no longer theoretical. The protocol was real, enforceable, and unambiguous. But here's the twist. While the document is precise, it leaves room for interpretation, a fact that insiders understand perfectly. Every ambiguous phrase, every clause requiring judgment, opens the door for discretion, negotiation, and subtle power plays. And this is where the palace's internal politics become even more fascinating. Those enforcing the rules wield significant discretion, and the ripple effect extends far beyond Meghan herself. Advisors, legal teams, and even media intermediaries must navigate the fine line between compliance and confrontation. One senior advisor described it as a strategic chessboard, where every move is measured, and one misstep can have consequences not just for the individual, but for the institution. In other words, Meghan is not simply facing restrictions. She is entering a controlled environment where every public move is scrutinized, and every public misstep can be amplified. And here's the kicker. The protocol didn't just apply to future appearances. Past engagements were also quietly assessed. Events, speeches, and initiatives from the preceding months were cataloged and reviewed. Each instance where royal association was leveraged, even inadvertently, was logged, analyzed, and in some cases flagged for potential media attention. Meghan's carefully curated past suddenly became a reference point for enforcement. This created a perfect storm. On one hand, the protocol is forward-looking, dictating the terms of public appearances going forward. On the other hand, it retroactively validates concerns about past behavior, amplifying the psychological pressure. Meghan is trapped between two worlds, the legacy she has built and the restrictions now formalized. And the emotional impact? Deep. Advisors reported that Meghan's initial reaction was fear, followed by a mixture of anger, disbelief, and frustration. She understood immediately that this was about more than titles. It was about influence, legacy, and identity. In a single, sweeping action, the palace had effectively recalibrated the balance of power. Meghan, once a figure with both personal agency and public influence, now faced a landscape where those powers were curtailed. But it doesn't stop there. The media leak introduced a new variable, public perception. Headlines, social media commentary, and international reporting began speculating about Meghan's reaction, her next moves, and potential pushback. Every article became a pressure point. Every image, every tweet, every caption became an indirect enforcement mechanism. The protocol was no longer just a legal and procedural document. It was an active, living force shaping perception, behavior, and influence in real time. And that brings us to the cliffhanger for this chapter. As Meghan absorbed the reality of these restrictions, she faced an impossible choice. How could she navigate upcoming events, speaking engagements, and philanthropic projects under these new constraints? How could she maintain influence, protect her legacy, and avoid public missteps, all while under unprecedented scrutiny? The morning after the protocol leak, Meghan Markle found herself in a room she hadn't planned to be in, a room of sudden uncertainty, heightened anxiety, and complex decisions. The first shockwave had passed, but what followed was far more personal, far more psychological. Suddenly, she wasn't just facing abstract rules. She was confronting real, tangible limitations on her identity and public persona. Her advisors had gathered quickly, their faces serious, almost solemn. Emails, messages, and private calls had come flooding in overnight. Every aide, every PR consultant, every legal advisor was focused on one task: how to respond to the protocol without escalating the situation further and without causing a public spectacle that could damage not just Meghan's reputation, but also her family's name. You need to understand the full scope, one senior advisor explained as Meghan scanned the document. It's not just a guideline. It's enforceable. Every public appearance, every introduction, every interview. You are now operating under restrictions that could be cited formally if misapplied. The weight of it hit her instantly. The titles she had once proudly carried, the brand she had built around influence and recognition, they were suddenly restrained. Every public speech, every media photograph, every social media post had to be measured against these new rules. There was no room for casual mistakes, no margin for error. Meghan's first instinct was to fight. Her natural charisma, her experience in Hollywood, her understanding of public perception, they all screamed at her to push back, to assert control. But this was different. This wasn't a paparazzi moment or a tabloid headline she could influence with charm or wit. This was the institution itself, silent, powerful, and immovable. And then came the first real test. An international charity gala, scheduled weeks in advance, was now under scrutiny. The invitation referenced her as Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex, a direct violation of the newly formalized protocol. Her PR team scrambled. Lawyers drafted memos. Organizers were contacted. Every option was evaluated. Could the invitation be quietly amended? Could she attend without being introduced by her title? Could the appearance be postponed? The problem was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Every action she took would be visible. Every decision could be scrutinized, misinterpreted, and amplified by the media. The protocol wasn't just a document. It was now a lens through which every move she made would be interpreted. And Meghan, despite her experience in managing public image, quickly realized the emotional toll. Every meeting, every discussion, every phone call carried the weight of scrutiny. Advisors whispered concerns about perception. Media reports hinted at her potential conflict with the palace. Social media buzzed with speculation. It was relentless. But here's the subtle genius of the palace's approach. The restrictions were not only legal, they were psychological. By forcing Meghan to navigate public appearances under strict, detailed rules, they effectively limited her ability to project influence, while leaving her visible enough to feel the pressure. It's a classic containment strategy, and it was working. At the gala, the tension was palpable. Meghan arrived, composed on the surface, but advisors noted small signs of stress. Tight jaw, rapid glances at her notes, and a heightened attention to how she was introduced. The event organizers, previously unaware of the protocol's enforcement, were now briefed to introduce her simply as Ms. Meghan Markle. Every camera, every headline, every photograph was filtered through this subtle but striking restriction. The media reaction was immediate. Headlines appeared online within hours. Meghan attends gala without royal title. Duchess of Sussex protocol enforced at first public appearance. Palace restrictions take effect. Analysts debated the implications. Influencers and commentators speculated on whether this marked a turning point in her public influence. Meghan felt the pressure mounting. Every step she took was under scrutiny. Every smile, every gesture, every word potentially a violation, or at least potentially misinterpreted. It was exhausting, and advisors reported that the Duchess seemed to internalize the weight of the protocol, reflecting privately on the sudden limitations imposed upon her autonomy. Yet, she was not passive. Meghan began exploring strategies to navigate the constraints. She considered alternative phrasing for speeches, rebranding her initiatives without direct royal references, and redirecting philanthropic messaging to emphasize personal experience rather than institutional affiliation. Every move was carefully planned. Every message was calculated. Even so, there was an unspoken tension in the room. Advisors whispered about potential backlash if the public perceived the restrictions as overly punitive. Media insiders speculated on whether the limitations might spark sympathy for Meghan. And somewhere deep in the palace, those enforcing the protocol were quietly assessing these reactions, weighing the next steps. The psychological complexity of this moment cannot be overstated. For Meghan, it was not merely about appearances, it was about identity. Titles had long been part of her public brand. They carried authority, recognition, and influence. And now, that authority was constrained, with every move monitored and every public action under potential scrutiny. Her team debated strategies late into the evening. Options were limited. They could either comply fully, risking the perception that she had lost influence, or test boundaries, risking formal enforcement and public controversy. Every choice had consequences. Every decision carried weight. And then came the tipping point. A media leak, subtle but undeniable, suggesting that the palace might extend restrictions beyond public appearances to her philanthropic initiatives. Advisors received anonymous notes hinting that even her personal brand, if intertwined with the royal connection, could face further scrutiny. The realization hit Meghan like a thunderbolt. The rules were evolving, and the full extent of enforcement was still unknown. The emotional stakes intensified. Observers noted a rare moment of vulnerability. Meghan, alone in her private quarters, reflecting on a sudden loss of control over her public identity. It was a stark contrast to her previous life, where influence had been measured, managed, and projected. Now, she was reacting, not controlling. And here's the dramatic irony. The very appearances she had crafted to maintain influence had accelerated the enforcement of the protocol. Each speech, each gala, each event became justification for further restrictions. The dominoes were falling faster than she could anticipate. By the end of the week, advisors confirmed that every upcoming appearance would be reviewed under the new rules. Communications teams were doubled. Legal oversight increased. Media strategies were overhauled. Meghan was effectively operating under a new reality. A highly structured, highly monitored framework where every public action required compliance with rules she had never expected to navigate. And that is where this chapter ends, with Meghan at the crossroads of influence and restriction, forced to make critical decisions while under unprecedented scrutiny. She is aware now that her every move is both an opportunity and a risk, and that the unfolding drama has only just begun. But here's the cliffhanger. As Meghan begins to navigate this restricted reality, who will leak the next piece of information to the public? And what unforeseen consequences will arise as her every appearance is filtered through the lens of protocol? The first real public storm arrived faster than anyone could have anticipated. Meghan Markle had barely begun navigating the newly enforced protocol when the world's attention turned into a magnifying glass, scrutinizing every move, every word, every gesture. And in the age of social media, scrutiny spreads not linearly but explosively, multiplying impact with each retweet, share, and headline. It started innocuously. A single tweet, noting her appearance at a charity gala without her royal title, quickly gathered traction. Influencers and commentators added context. The palace protocol is real. Meghan must now navigate appearances without her Duchess title. Then came the first viral posts. Side-by-side images of Meghan with and without her title, commentary on royal fading influence, and speculation about her public role. But social media was just the beginning. Mainstream outlets picked up the story, framing it as a significant turning point. Meghan Markle faces new public constraints. Royal protocol limits Meghan's influence. Is the Duchess losing authority? Headlines, online articles, and news segments dissected every detail. Analysts debated how this would affect Meghan's public image, her brand, and her influence on international audiences. The timing couldn't have been more strategic for the palace. By the time the world reacted, the internal rules were already in place, enforceable, and documented. The protocol had shifted from quiet bureaucracy to a public spectacle, all while remaining legally binding. Every post, every image, every headline became both evidence and enforcement. Meghan herself watched in disbelief. Advisors noted her unease as the story spread. Each alert, each notification, each email carried the weight of 1,000 judgments. And yet, she knew she could not retreat. Every decision now mattered. Every move required careful consideration, and every misstep could be amplified into a headline. One advisor described the situation. It wasn't just media scrutiny, it was a psychological pressure cooker. Every interaction was a test. Every public appearance a challenge. And Meghan knew that, even if she complied, she was being measured against an ideal she could no longer fully define. Meanwhile, social media commentary intensified. Memes, opinion threads, and speculation about Meghan's next move spread across platforms. Some portrayed her as a victim of institutional control. Others questioned her ability to maintain influence. Fandoms divided, and hashtags exploded. Within hours, the Duchess's public presence became a lightning rod, and the palace's subtle enforcement strategy now had a visible, measurable effect. The backlash didn't stop at digital commentary. Invitations to speaking engagements, previously extended with her royal title, were quietly amended. Event organizers were instructed on how to introduce her without the Duchess designation. Some engagements were canceled entirely, leaving her team scrambling to re-strategize. Every attempt to maintain influence was now filtered through a regulatory lens. Here's the striking psychological impact. Meghan's public identity had become a contested space. Her audience expected authority, her advisors demanded compliance, and the palace monitored every move. The tension was relentless. Advisors reported sleepless nights, frantic calls, and strategy meetings that extended into early mornings. For Meghan, the wait was not just professional. It was personal, emotional, and deeply isolating. Then came the first private reaction. Sources close to the Duchess revealed moments of vulnerability. Late-night phone calls to friends expressing frustration, whispered doubts about navigating the new rules, and reflections on the emotional toll of seeing her influence curtailed so publicly. Meghan, once confident in her public persona, was now forced to confront limitations she had never anticipated. But it wasn't all despair. Meghan began to strategize. She considered subtle ways to maintain presence without directly violating protocol, emphasizing personal experiences, redirecting philanthropic messaging, and leveraging interviews that focused on her initiatives rather than her royal association. Every move was measured, every word weighed, and every appearance recalibrated. Still, the social media storm raged. Analysts debated whether this was a strategic win for the palace or a setback. Headlines questioned her next steps, public opinion became polarized, and even casual observers felt invested in her struggle. For the first time, Meghan was navigating not just a protocol, but an ecosystem of global attention that amplified every decision, every appearance, and every misstep. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was equally intense. Senior advisors reviewed every headline, social media post, and news clip. The enforcement strategy had succeeded beyond expectations. Meghan's actions were now entirely predictable within the framework of the protocol. And yet, discussions continued about how to manage the evolving media narrative, anticipating further public reaction. By the end of the week, Meghan's schedule had been rewritten multiple times. Every event now required pre-approval, every appearance had to be carefully crafted, and every public statement was filtered through a lens of compliance. Advisors worked tirelessly to anticipate potential violations before they could occur, and social media remained an unpredictable variable that demanded constant attention. The emotional impact on Meghan deepened. Advisors noted moments of anxiety, frustration, and near panic. She recognized the constraints, but also the visibility of the restrictions. The world was watching not just her compliance, but her reaction.